There's a moment that happens to all of us. A moment where everything seems clear, where the path forward feels obvious, where logic and reason appear to be guiding our hand. And then, days later, weeks later, sometimes even just hours later, we look back and ask ourselves a question that echoes through the corridors of our mind with an almost painful clarity: what was I thinking? It's a universal experience, this confrontation with our own poor judgment. We've all been there. Standing in the wreckage of a decision that made perfect sense at the time but now appears absurd, reckless, or just painfully misguided. Maybe it was a relationship you knew was wrong from the start but pursued anyway. Maybe it was a financial choice that seemed brilliant in the moment but cost you dearly. Maybe it was something you said in anger, something you bought on impulse, something you committed to without thinking it through. The specifics change, but the feeling remains the same, a strange mixture of confusion, regret, and disbelief at your own behavior. But here's what's fascinating, what's truly remarkable about these moments of clarity: they reveal something profound about the architecture of the human mind. And perhaps nobody understood this architecture better than a Florentine diplomat who lived 500 years ago, a man whose name has become synonymous with cunning and strategic thinking, yet whose insights into human psychology remain startlingly relevant today. Niccolò Machiavelli. The name itself conjures images of scheming politicians and ruthless power plays. But strip away the mythology, ignore the caricature, and what you find is something far more interesting: a philosopher who understood, with painful clarity, why people make the decisions they do, and more importantly, why those decisions so often lead to disaster.
In 1513, exiled from Florence, stripped of his position, tortured and broken, Machiavelli sat down in his small cottage and began to write. The result was The Prince, a slim volume that would become one of the most controversial books ever written. But here's what most people miss about Machiavelli: he wasn't teaching immorality. He was diagnosing a disease. The disease of self-deception. The disease of believing our own stories about ourselves while ignoring the harsh realities that actually govern human behavior. And today, we're going to explore bad decisions through Machiavelli's unflinching lens. We're going to examine why intelligent, capable, otherwise rational people make choices that sabotage their own interests. Because Machiavelli understood something that modern psychology has only recently confirmed: we are not the rational creatures we pretend to be. We are driven by forces we barely understand, forces that operate beneath the surface of conscious awareness, shaping our choices in ways we cannot perceive until it's too late. Machiavelli wrote that men judge by appearances rather than by the reality of things. They are more easily deceived by what seems to be than by what actually is. This wasn't cynicism. It was observation. Cold, hard, empirical observation of how human beings actually behave when you strip away all the pleasant fictions we tell ourselves. And this is where our journey begins. With a simple but devastating truth: most of our bad decisions stem not from a lack of information, but from our refusal to see what's right in front of us. Let's start with a story. It's 1502, and Cesare Borgia, the infamous son of Pope Alexander VI, has just brutally consolidated his power in the Romagna region of Italy. Machiavelli is sent as an envoy to observe Borgia, and what he witnesses becomes the foundation for his understanding of human nature and decision-making. Machiavelli watched this pattern repeat itself across every level of Italian society in his time. City-states would make alliances based on immediate advantage, only to find themselves trapped in conflicts that destroyed them. Leaders would appease threats to buy short-term peace, only to face those same threats again, now stronger and more dangerous. And always, people would convince themselves that they were being wise, being prudent, being strategic, right up until the moment their choices caught up with them. He wrote that the Romans, in their darkest hours, never allowed present fear to override their judgment about what needed to be done. When Hannibal was devastating Italy, when the very existence of Rome hung in the balance, they didn't make desperate short-term decisions. They stuck to their principles. They played the long game. They endured immediate pain for eventual victory. But most of us, most of the time, we do the opposite. We sacrifice our long-term interests for short-term relief. And we do it while telling ourselves we're being reasonable, practical, realistic. This brings us to another of Machiavelli's core insights: one that cuts straight to the heart of why bad decisions are so common. We consistently misjudge the nature of risk. In The Prince, Machiavelli discusses the concept of fortuna, which we might translate as fortune or chance, but which really means something closer to the unpredictable chaos of circumstances beyond our control. He famously compares fortuna to a raging river that floods and destroys everything in its path. But, he notes, in times of calm, wise people build dams and channels to control where the water flows when the next flood comes. The problem is that humans, in times of calm, almost never build those dams. We wait. We hope. We convince ourselves that maybe this time will be different. Maybe the flood won't come. Maybe we'll get lucky. Machiavelli watched princes ignore obvious threats, fail to prepare for entirely predictable disasters, and then act shocked when those disasters arrived. And his diagnosis was simple: we are terrible at assessing risk because we let our desires cloud our judgment. We see what we want to see, and we want to see a world where the uncomfortable, difficult, expensive preparations aren't necessary. Modern psychology has confirmed this observation in exhaustive detail. We have something called optimism bias, the tendency to believe that bad things are less likely to happen to us than to other people. We have normalcy bias, the tendency to assume that things will continue as they have been, even when all the evidence suggests change is coming. We have present bias, the tendency to overvalue immediate rewards and undervalue future consequences. But Machiavelli didn't need psychological studies to understand this. He watched it play out in real time, again and again, as Italian city-states failed to prepare for invasions they knew were coming, as leaders ignored threats they knew existed, as people made decisions based on hope rather than reality. He tells a story about how the Italian states, wealthy and prosperous, watched the French King Charles VIII assemble a massive army on their border. The threat was obvious. The danger was clear. But the Italian leaders, unable to agree on a response, unwilling to spend the money and effort required to prepare an adequate defense, unwilling to face the uncomfortable reality of their situation, did nothing. They negotiated. They delayed. They hoped for the best. And then Charles marched into Italy with his army, and it was a catastrophe. Cities fell almost without resistance. The Italian forces, unprepared and divided, were swept aside. And all the leaders who had failed to prepare, who had closed their eyes to the obvious danger, they stood in the ruins of their cities and asked themselves, how did this happen? What could we have done differently? Machiavelli's answer was simple and devastating: you could have seen what was right in front of you. You could have prepared. You could have acted. But you didn't, because you preferred the comfortable lie to the uncomfortable truth. This pattern, this preference for comfortable lies, it shows up everywhere in our decision-making. You know your industry is changing, that your skills are becoming obsolete, but you don't let rain because that would require admitting vulnerability. You know your financial situation is unsustainable, that you're spending more than you earn, but you don't change your habits because that would require acknowledging that your lifestyle is built on a foundation of denial. You know a relationship or friendship isn't working, that the problems are fundamental rather than temporary, but you don't address it because that would require facing painful truths. And the thing is, in the moment, this denial feels like wisdom. It feels like you're being mature, patient, reasonable. You're not overreacting. You're not being alarmist. You're keeping things in perspective. But what you're actually doing is the same thing those Italian princes did, waiting for the disaster to arrive before you acknowledge it's coming. Machiavelli writes about this with a kind of cold fury. He says that men are generally ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and greedy. This sounds like pure cynicism, like the bitter words of someone who's given up on humanity. But read it in context, and you realize he's not being cynical. He's being diagnostic. He's describing patterns of behavior that he observed consistently, predictably, across every level of society. And the pattern he observed was this: people make decisions based on how they feel in the moment, not on rational assessment of long-term interests. When times are good, when fortune smiles, people are generous, loyal, brave. They make promises. They form alliances. They commit to principles. But the moment circumstances change, The moment those commitments become inconvenient or costly, most people abandon them without a second thought. This isn't because people are evil. It's because they're driven by what Machiavelli calls immediate necessity. What feels urgent right now, what the present moment demands, that's what shapes our choices. And our brains are exceptionally good at convincing us that whatever serves our immediate interests is actually the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, the only reasonable choice available. You commit to going to the gym, to eating better, to building healthier habits. And you mean it. The commitment is genuine. But then you're tired after work, and the couch looks comfortable, and you tell yourself that you'll start tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes next month. And before you know it, the commitment has evaporated, and you've constructed an elaborate story about why this is actually fine, actually the right choice given your circumstances. Or you commit to a project at work, promise a colleague you'll help them, agree to take on responsibilities. But then other things come up, more urgent things, more immediately pressing concerns. And slowly, without ever making a conscious decision to abandon your commitment, it just fades away. And you don't think of yourself as fickle or unreliable. You think of yourself as someone who's being realistic, someone who's adapting to changing circumstances. Machiavelli watched leaders make grand commitments in times of strength, swearing eternal alliances and unbreakable principles. And then he watched those same leaders violate every commitment the moment it became inconvenient. Not because they were uniquely corrupt, but because this is what humans do. We are reliable when reliability is easy and unreliable when reliability is hard. And this leads to one of Machiavelli's most controversial but most important insights: if you make decisions based on the assumption that people will be consistent, principled, and true to their word, you will make catastrophically bad decisions. Because most people, most of the time, will not be those things when the circumstances change. This doesn't mean you should be cynical or mistrustful of everyone. But it does mean you need to structure your decisions with an understanding of how people actually behave under pressure, not how you wish they would behave. It means preparing for the possibility of betrayal, even from trusted allies. It means not relying on promises when incentives point in the opposite direction. It means understanding that people's actions are shaped far more by their circumstances than by their character. In The Prince, Machiavelli tells the story of how Cesare Borgia hired a group of mercenaries, called the Orsini, to help him conquer territory. They were effective soldiers, and they helped him win several victories. But Borgia understood something crucial: a mercenaries fight for money, not loyalty. Their commitment lasts exactly as long as they're being paid and as long as fighting is in their interest. The moment circumstances change, they become unreliable at best and dangerous at worst. So Borgia, even while working with the Orsini, was building his own army, creating structures of power that didn't depend on their continued loyalty. And when the time came, when the Orsini's interests diverged from his own, he was prepared. This is a lesson that applies far beyond Renaissance warfare. It applies to business partnerships, friendships, political alliances, even romantic relationships. If you build your life, your plans, your future on the assumption that people will always act in your best interest, that they will remain loyal regardless of circumstances, you are setting yourself up for disappointment and disaster. This doesn't mean you should expect the worst from everyone. But it does mean you should pay attention to incentives. You should ask yourself, what happens if circumstances change? What happens if the costs of loyalty increase? What happens if the rewards for betrayal become more attractive? Machiavelli understood that the smartest leaders weren't those who trusted blindly or distrusted universally, but those who built systems that functioned even when people acted selfishly. They didn't rely on goodwill alone. They aligned incentives. They prepared for human weakness instead of pretending it didn't exist. And this brings us back to you. To your decisions. To the moments when you look back and ask yourself, with that familiar mix of confusion and regret, what was I thinking? Because when you strip away the details, when you peel back the layers of justification and rationalization, most bad decisions share the same underlying structure. They're built on a refusal to see reality clearly. They're driven by short-term comfort over long-term health. They rely on hopeful assumptions about risk, about fortune, about other people's behavior. And they're justified by stories we tell ourselves to protect our self-image in the moment. Machiavelli didn't offer comforting advice. He didn't tell people what they wanted to hear. He didn't promise easy solutions or simple moral lessons. What he offered instead was clarity. A ruthless, unsentimental clarity about how the world actually works and how human beings actually behave within it. And that clarity is uncomfortable, because it forces us to confront the fact that many of our worst mistakes weren't accidents. They weren't unavoidable. They weren't the result of bad luck or insufficient information. They were the predictable outcome of patterns we repeat over and over again. If you found value in this exploration, if these insights resonated with you or challenged the way you think about your own choices, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps this content reach others who might benefit from seeing their decisions through Machiavelli's unflinching lens. And subscribe, because we're going to continue pulling back the curtain on the hidden forces that shape human behavior, one uncomfortable truth at a time. This is just the beginning of understanding why we do what we do, and more importantly, how to do better.